Peter House is a 2000 graduate of Mayville
Bard Theological School. He has served as ministerial intern and summer minister at the First Unitarian Congregation of Toronto, summer minister at First Unitarian Church in Rochester, and has served since 2007 as the summer minister at the First Universalist Church of Rochester. During the year, Peter is a special education teacher working with fifth grade students. Peter and his partner, Michael Hannon, live in Rochester. Peter?
I just wanted to say before I started, I believe I started coming here in 2014, so I think it's 10 years. And thank you. And there were points when I started to worry about the size of the congregation. And it is just wonderful to see such growth and so many new people, and it's just to see everything thriving here. It's really, really wonderful. So, I'm not one to brag. I rarely talk about this, but I came into an unexpected inheritance in 1991. When my paternal grandmother died that year, it never crossed my mind that I would inherit anything at all. So I was surprised to learn that I was in line to inherit $327. Think about it. $327 unexpected dollars. What a windfall. What would I do with this money? The possibilities were endless. A new winter jacket and maybe even a pair of shoes, a new rug to cover my bare living room floor, or maybe I could put the money toward my student loan payments. Or I wondered, should I save it and invest it? I mean, who knows? I was 28 at the time. By the time I was retired, that money to maybe grow to $2,000 or $3,000. Who knows? I ended up paying a rather high price for this inheritance. A high enough price that if I had it to do over again, I'm not sure that I would have accepted it at all. My grandmother was poor by pretty much anyone's measure. She and my grandfather never owned a house. They never had a car that was newer than 7 years old when they bought it. And I never got a gift for birthdays or Christmas from them that wasn't either handmade by my grandmother or bought at a dollar store. They rented a tiny little apartment in a rundown house. They used to hang tea bags up over the sink to use them twice. And when they made their annual trip to Erie, Pennsylvania to visit their friends, they would take their things in boxes and paper bags. My grandfather worked on a loading dock until he had a heart attack at the age of 74. And after he died, my grandmother lived entirely on Social Security, like sadly lots of people in this country do. She never had a will. I think she probably thought she didn't need one since she didn't have anything of any value monetarily to leave anyone. But after she died, it was revealed she actually had $3,000 in the bank. My father died when he was only 43, so his parents outlived him by many years. Since there was no will, my two sisters and I were legally entitled to half of my grandmother's estate, and the other half went to my father's only sister. And this, as everyone can probably already see the setup, is where the drama began. My sisters and I had always had a cordial but not especially close relationship with my Aunt Judy. Like my grandparents, she also struggled financially, and she certainly could have used the money. When we first got letters from the lawyer telling us that we were entitled to half of this money in my grandmother's account, we all said the same thing. We all said we felt that Aunt Judy should get it. After all, she was my grandmother's only living child. She was my grandmother's primary support person, and she could definitely use the money. So we told Aunt Judy that all we wanted was a chance to look through my grandmother's things and choose a few sentimental items to remember my grandparents by. As I've said, they didn't have anything of monetary value at all. But I have to say, and I say this with love, my Grandma Carrie was the kitsch queen. Every single corner of that tiny, ratty little apartment was decorated with dime store knickknacks and prints of Paris street scenes and plastic frames and silk and plastic flower arrangements that she made herself and little wreaths that she had done. There wasn't a single surface in that entire place that she didn't decorate. In fact, that she didn't over-decorate. One time when my cousin Laura and I went into Woolworths at Christmas time, Laura looked around at all the kitchen. She finally said to me, "I think we've died and gone to Grandma Carrie heaven." So there was certainly enough schlock to go around. My Aunt Judy and each of Grandma Carrie's 7 grandchildren could have easily filled 2 boxes each, and we still would have had plenty left over to make a pretty good donation to the Goodwill. I wanted 2 things. A framed 1950s picture taken from a calendar and put into a Kresge's 50-cent frame of Hoops Park, which is Auburn's prettiest park. And I also wanted a miniature pair of salt and pepper shakers that my father had bought for Grandma Carrie when he was 5 years old. His uncle had taken him to the 5 and dime store and given him a nickel to buy something, and he bought her these little salt and pepper shakers, and she used to show them to me. So I reminded Aunt Judy several times that I wanted these 2 items, and she promised each time that she would set them aside for me. My sister wanted a collection of letters that my father had written to Grandma Carrie when he was in the Korean War. Grandma had showed these to us many times. She kept them in a bundle tied in a ribbon in her cedar chest in her bedroom. Now these were especially precious because our father had predeceased his own mother by many years, and we were kids when he died, so to get this kind of adult perspective on his life would have been really valuable. And Aunt Judy promised to set those aside as well. What we all really wanted was one last chance to see the tiny little apartment that my grandparents had lived in since the 1960s. The impossibly cramped little space where Grandma Carrie nonetheless managed to squeeze 16 or 17 people into one room every Christmas for brunch. And she still had enough space left over for a full-size Christmas tree. And she handed out at least 10 to 15 presents to each person. All little dime store items, and she would really do this, like little pencils individually wrapped or rolls of lifesavers, all wrapped up like Christmas gifts. And she'd stand there and hand them all out from this, several boxes actually. So my sisters and I were hoping for one last opportunity to see the little decrepit space the way our grandmother had left it. Plastic flower arrangements and all. We checked in several times with Aunt Judy to see when she would get to cleaning out the apartment, and we offered to help if she wanted us. And each time she did promise that she would keep us informed. And then one day, my sister Joan called Aunt Judy to ask when she thought we could visit and when we were going to get around to this task of going through the things. And Aunt Judy said, "Oh, you don't have to worry, dear. It's all done. My kids and I cleaned out the apartment last week. It's all clean, and we gave the keys back to the landlord." So my sister was kind of stunned. "But we had wanted some things," she said. "Oh, don't worry, dear," Aunt Judy said. "I set all of those things aside for you." So this was a few weeks before Christmas. And on Christmas Eve, my cousins came to a gathering at my mother's house with one fairly small box from Aunt Judy. In the box were pictures of my father at various stages of his life, my father's yearbook and his diplomas and some things related to his military service, a couple of cards that he had made for Grandma Carrie on Mother's Day and other occasions, and one little cat knick-knack that my mother had brought back to Grandma Carrie when my parents went on their honeymoon. And that was it. No framed picture of Hoops Park, no letters from Korea, no salt and pepper shakers, and none of the other sentimental items that we had requested. It seemed that the box only contained the items that Aunt Judy decided we could have, with no apparent consideration given for any of the requests that we had made. So my sisters and I were at first disappointed and then angry. What right did she have? What right to make this decision for us? After all, we had just as much legal right to decide how to distribute these things, didn't we? The law was on our side. Because my grandmother had died without a will and because my father had predeceased her, his children were legally entitled to half of her estate. We didn't say anything, though. We didn't want to make waves. We didn't want to cause a family rift. It was a few weeks after that my father's cousin, who was a lawyer, contacted us to let us know that Grandma Carey had $3,000 in a bank account and that we were legally entitled to half. Now, as luck would have it, just a few days later, my sister ran into Aunt Judy at the grocery store. She asked Aunt Judy about the letter, and she told her, Aunt Judy said, yes, there is a bank account, but it's essentially empty. There's maybe a few $100s in it at best, but certainly nowhere near $3,000. And she also said that Grandma Carey had debts that far exceeded the amount of money that was in this account, and that we should simply sign away our claim on it as quickly as we could so that the estate could all be closed. So we double-checked with the lawyer, and he confirmed that no, there was indeed $3,116 in the account, and that all the debts had been paid. We were entitled to $1,558, split three ways, minus his fee, of course, even though he was our cousin, for a grand total of $327 each. Well, so we had initially decided that Aunt Judy should get it all. But now we were angry, and we felt that we had been treated unjustly, first with the apartment and then with the apparent deception over the bank account. So we decided that we would show Aunt Judy. We wanted our $327. So this dispute ended up causing the very rift that my sisters and I were initially committed to avoiding. Aunt Judy was hurt and angry, and her 4 children were absolutely furious and highly defensive of their mother, who they saw as wronged by us, and so they ceased all contact with us as well. About maybe 6 or 8 months after this, I sent Aunt Judy a letter in which I clearly outlined the reasons for why we were upset, why we had made the decision to take our share of the money, and saying that I wanted to fix things. I tried really, really hard to keep the tone neutral and not to snipe or accuse, but simply use I statements to let her know how I felt. See, I was enrolled in the Masters in Counseling program at the time, and we were really big on I statements. I even had a few people read the letter ahead of time to make sure that it wasn't inflammatory, and I was assured by everyone that read it that it wasn't. I naively hoped that if she just understood my perspective and acknowledged her role in the situation, we could mend fences. Keep in mind, I was 28 at the time. Instead, she responded with an angry, grievance-filled letter which cataloged in great detail every perceived slight or misstep my mother and my sisters and I had ever made. She accused me of not having sufficiently loved my grandmother, and then she used the ultimate trump card by claiming that my long-deceased father would be ashamed of how I was behaving and who I had become. So, as probably makes sense at this point in the story, as far as I was concerned, that sealed the deal. I was done. I had been the injured party, and yet I had made a clean and honest attempt to set things right. And my effort had been met with spite and vitriol. I was done. I would not respond in kind. I just would not respond at all. And I didn't for 19 years. Every so often I would start to feel bad and I would consider reaching out to Aunt Judy, but every single time I considered doing this, I was stopped by another much more powerful thought. I couldn't bring myself to reach out until I was sure that Aunt Judy was willing to own her role in our rift. And periodically, I would hear from other extended family members that indeed she was still angry and still blamed me for the problem because she felt I had treated her unfairly, and she still felt that she had done nothing wrong. So, given that scenario, I continued my resolve. I was not going to reach out. 1991 was a long time ago. I have seen a lot of life since then. And I have come to appreciate many things that I couldn't see back then. And my biggest insight, ironically, came to me when I visited another aunt, my Aunt Jean, my mother's sister. Now, I knew my Aunt Jean much, much better than I ever knew Aunt Judy, and I had a much closer relationship with her. But I didn't know her as well as I thought I did. And it was a single snapshot that I saw that completely changed my perspective. One Thanksgiving, we were at Aunt Jean's house, and she had on her refrigerator a black and white snapshot of herself and Uncle Joe, her husband. They were in a setting that I didn't recognize. They were wearing clothes that I had never seen, and they were posing for this picture with three completely unfamiliar people to me. The photo even, there was something about the photo that captured facial expressions and body language in them that wasn't familiar to me. It was as if the Aunt Jean and Uncle Joe that I saw every single Sunday my entire life were strangers. I guess I really had thought that I had seen every single picture that ever existed of them, and that by extension, I guess that I assumed that I knew everything there was to know about them, that I knew them in their entirety. So, as is probably obvious to most of us, in fact, it probably would have been obvious to lots of people sooner, it didn't really strike me in a meaningful way until I saw this picture. The idea that we can never, never truly know another human being. Even those we love and consider ourselves close to are largely unknown to us. I remember looking at that picture of Aunt Jean and Uncle Joe and thinking, I only know a very limited piece of them. I see them maybe once a week for a few hours. They live whole entire lives that don't include me. They were alive a long time before I was too. So I only know about their past lives from the stories that I've heard. And because I'm only familiar with a sliver of their entire beings, I can't really know what struggles and burdens and pain and angst they may carry with them. I can only surmise what disappointments they've overcome, what traumas shaped who they became, what wounds motivate their behavior, what limits did their individual experiences place upon them, which hopes were dashed, which words crushed them, which moments defined them, who may have hurt them, who undermined their confidence, who disappointed them or let them down, what longing lived in them that was perpetually unfulfilled. I didn't know. We never know. Never. We can't. Each and every human soul is too complex and too battered by mere experience, the experience of living in a relatively harsh world. We can never fully understand them. They can't be understood. It's too hard. And expecting bruised and flawed human beings to behave perfectly and graciously and generously and justly in every single situation is unfair and unjust and unwise. I began, after that insight, to think about Aunt Judy and what may have motivated her to do what she had done. I thought about, however, and I hadn't thought about this before, I thought about what I did know, but I hadn't really stopped to consider before now. My father had wounded Judy. He wounded her deeply, and that wound never went away, and it never went away because my father never let it. My father, as often happens in families, didn't approve of Judy's choice of husband. My father was not wrong to have his doubts. Wayne was an alcoholic and not good at holding a job. He had an explosive temper, and he had done prison time for arson. So it's not hard to understand why my father didn't want his baby sister to marry him. But Judy chose him, and Judy loved him, and by the way, they stayed together for 46 years. And for reasons only Judy understood, the relationship seemed to work for her. And if the truth be told, my father's objection seemed always to me to have more to do with the family image than it did with Judy's well-being. See, my father was a police officer in a small town, and having a sister who was married to someone with a well-known and pretty shady rap sheet was an embarrassment. And this, by the way, is always what I heard when Wayne's name came up. I never heard my father complain about Wayne not providing well for his sister or treating his sister well. What I always heard about was what an embarrassment Wayne was to him. What a stain it was having Wayne as a brother-in-law on the image that he liked to project. I do know, I never was able to get the details, but I know that at some point my father and Judy had a horrible showdown over Wayne, which essentially boiled down to my father vowing to disown Judy if she went through with the marriage. And I know that my father kept that promise. He avoided Judy when he could, and he was indifferent to her when we were together. And I know from what other relatives have told me that Judy never ever got over the pain of this rejection by an older brother that she idolized. Judy hadn't completed the Master's in Counseling program at SUNY Brockport, nor did she have any formal education beyond an LPN course at Auburn Memorial Hospital in the early 1960s. So she likely had not learned that I statements are meant to convey one's feelings, concerns, and needs without blaming, shaming, or threatening. It can be easy for some of us to forget that the explosion in self-awareness and effective communication techniques were not a phenomenon familiar to most people, but the very educated and urban elite really until the past few decades. So in the working class, conflict-avoidant family that Judy grew up in during the 1940s and the 1950s, a letter like the one I sent her, despite all of its I statements, was an attack, an accusation, fighting words, a call to arms, certainly not a letter to be received as the forthright, heartfelt bridge builder that I had intended to send. So, what else? What else might have been going on that I could not even, and still to this day, can only guess at, that I couldn't know? Did Judy and my grandmother perhaps have a private understanding that she was to keep everything that she wanted because she was my grandmother's only living child? And if so, did Judy maybe keep that understanding to herself in an effort to spare conflict and to spare hurt feelings? Did my grandmother have resentments toward us that no one ever shared with us, and that my grandmother, being the kind of person she was, certainly never would have shared? It's true to say that we drifted apart a little bit after we lost my father as a connection point, and I will say, too, that Grandma Carrie was not happy at all when my mother remarried. So was Aunt Judy possibly keeping a promise to her mother and then trying to shield my sisters and I from the pain? Another thing that never occurred to me until I was preparing this, but I think it's really possibly likely, was Wayne actually running the show unbeknownst to us. Wayne did have, I will say, a long, well-known history of selling Judy's possessions to buy alcohol. So is it possible that Wayne went and cleaned out my grandmother's apartment for the same reason, and then Judy was embarrassed to tell us that that's what had happened? I'll never know. In the same way that I only knew a sliver of Aunt Jean and Uncle Joe's total life, I only knew a speck of who Judy was. The falling out with my father, which happened when I was about a year old, combined with my father's early death and my mother's remarriage, had created too much distance over too much time. And when Grandma Carrie died, I think what happened is that all of the grief and resentment and hurt manifested itself in a tug of war over $3,000, a bundle of letters, and a set of dime store salt and pepper shakers. Who could ever say how far back we would have to go to find the blame in all of it? Judy hurt me, whether intentionally or not, and I hurt her back. But was it even just the two of us interacting with each other, or were we both merely playing small roles in a much bigger story that neither of us really had much of a hand in writing? So this morning, I told a long and very personal story. But I chose to tell it because I think it is universally relatable. We all come from families with complicated and at times contentious histories. We have all been hurt, and we have all hurt back in equal measure. And each and every one of us have withheld at least one "I'm sorry" at some point because we felt that the other person was not sufficiently contrite. What I came to realize many, many years too late is that we can always say, "I'm sorry." And we can always say it, regardless of what led us to the division in the first place. And this is why, because the circumstances are always larger and far more complicated than the people involved. Everyone's feelings are fragile and urgent and valid. When we say "I'm sorry," we aren't accepting blame as much as we are acknowledging the other person's vulnerability and their ultimate humanity. And as obvious and as fundamental as this message may seem on the surface, just stop to think for a minute about the world that we are living in, which is becoming ever more self-centered and ever more polarized. I don't think this message can be repeated or pondered too often. Now, I like to add these things. I obviously recognize that there may be an exception in situations where someone has truly been abused and violated. But in the overall picture of our total lives, nuanced stories like the ones I told this morning are far more common than instances of grievous abuse. So in 2010, I attended one of those large group personal awareness seminars, you know, the kind that you always see parodied on sitcoms. And at one point, you're always supposed to write letters to everyone you've ever fallen out with and ask for their forgiveness. So I went to one, and after 19 years, I wrote to Aunt Judy. And ironically, it turned out to be the same week that she was awaiting results for a biopsy to see if she had cancer. Now, I know that this sounds like a very cliched story device, but this is exactly how it happened. She was, in fact, too overcome at the moment to call me herself, so she had my cousin, her daughter Debbie, call me instead. Mom thinks that it's a bad sign that that letter came while she's waiting for the results of her biopsy, she said. And for the second time in our history together, my reaching out to Aunt Judy had caused unintended pain. My cousin Debbie did call back about a week later and let me know that indeed, not only was the biopsy positive, but the diagnosis was terminal. So when Aunt Judy and I finally did speak, neither one of us actually said, "I'm sorry." I had already said so in the letter I sent her. I can't guess at why she didn't say it. But she did say, "I love you," each and every time she spoke to me after that. And about 9 months later, I had the honor of being present in the room when she drew her last breath. I truly mean it when I say, I do not believe in dwelling on regrets, and I learned a long time ago what a pointless and futile exercise that is. They serve little purpose, and they don't fully honor the totality of who we were in years past. And we need to show in these situations some compassion for ourselves as well. Not just compassion for the people we are now, but compassion for the person that we were when we made whatever mistake it was we think we made. So I will only close by saying I am grateful that I did say I'm sorry before it was too late.